Well, welcome everyone to our DG Connect University webinar, which is today about the Digital Decade Report 2024, and specifically how it is setting the scene for the new EU's digital policy agenda. We would like to thank you very much for your interest as you're joining us today for this event, which will last until noon. DG Connect has invited today 3 guest speakers, which we will introduce shortly, to discuss the progress made towards the vision of the digital decade through 2030, and this in a context of President von der Leyen's EU priorities for 2024-2029. Another objective of this panel will be to show the essence of how the State of the Digital Decade report this year has been feeding into these priorities and how it resonates with the momentum that has been raised by this year's inputs with proposals and conversations such as seen with the Draghi report, the Letta report, and more. First, a little word about the format and some housekeeping rules, as we're mindful this is an online meeting. The session is being recorded and will be published on our YouTube channel. There will be a set of Slido questions that you as participants can react to and respond to through the webinar. You can also yourself use Slido to ask your own questions to our panelists, and these questions may be addressed after the speakers have taken the floor. As always, there are many questions that will remain unanswered during the session, but we will, as usual, get back to you in writing in Futurium. And as some of you know, if necessary, to just remind you, Futurium is an online channel we can use, and you can use it as well to get yourselves informed about our events, about our news, etc. Now, the agenda of this event is made of 2 parts. First, there will be a presentation about the report, the second State of the Digital Decade report published in July 2024, especially also aligning with the next Commission's priorities. So for about 30 minutes, you will hear from Erik Peters, who is our acting head of unit in the unit responsible for the Digital Decade Policy Program. And then we will initiate a discussion and reactions from our 3 great speakers, which we warmly thank for joining us today at DG Connect. We'll have Georg Rikeles, who is Associate Director at the European Policy Center. We'll have Nicolas Poitier, who is Research Fellow at Bruegel, and Ms. Léa Offray, who is Head of International Affairs and Single Market at BEUC, who is the European Consumer Organization. They will basically share their thoughts on the ways in which the report and the process of the decade and its elements feed into the discussions on the next priorities of the Commission and the conversations that I mentioned have entertained the EU debate on key issues. The remaining time will be dedicated to collect and ask questions that we'll get from you, but we also have our own questions just in case. But it is now time to kick off. Thank you very much again all for joining. I'm giving the floor to Erik Peters to present the report. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen, and thank you for the Connect University team to have organized this session, which is indeed very timely. It's indeed very important to remind ourselves of the key findings that the massive report, I will say 1,700 pages of the State of the Digital Decade as released last July in the context of this period where we are thinking on the next priorities for the next college. But before I go into a deep dive in the report, I'd like to make an observation, which is maybe obvious, but to say that the moment in which we are reflecting at today is very different from 10 years or even 5 years ago. We are really in a special moment for Europe. We are in a moment where security is paramount. Security because of climate change risks. Because, of course, of wars raging in Europe and outside. Security for our supply chain. So this security element is really critical. The other very striking aspect today is the critical role of digital transformation. Not just for our prosperity, and it was clearly mentioned in the Draghi report released recently, but more generally because what is at stake is also our democracy, our people, the way we are managing our society, the way we shape our society. And this aspect requires a 360-degree horizon scanning for action. We cannot just focus on infrastructure. We cannot focus only on skills. We need to have an overview on all these different aspects. The third critical element of this moment is the fact that speed and scale matters even more than ever. We see this for public organization, for business, the way we can be agile, but also be powered by scale is a matter that is extremely important. And these three elements, security, the role of digitalization, and speed and scale, lead us to the intuition that we need to do things differently. We need to be much more strategic, to look long-term, to persevere in our actions, but also to bring all the ecosystem and all the energies all together in a way that bring an effective action. And this is exactly the story of the digital decade. The digital decade that was launched by President von der Leyen in 2021, right after the COVID, is precisely aiming at having a long-term view, common objective, and also maybe even more importantly, cooperation. I mean, there is no challenge that we are facing today that can be dealt with by single member states, even the greater. And cooperation is very much at the heart of the digital decade. I will put to you the finding of this report, but this finding is a result of a day-to-day cooperation with member states, not just in the top-down approach, but really much also with a bottom-up contribution from member states who are really contributing in joint teams that we have within the Commission with member states, with the Digital Decade Board that is really crystallizing this cooperation, and also with the help of concrete projects like new edicts that we have launched in various fields, and many of them are in preparation that enable member states with the Commission to have infrastructure and to develop digitalization in very concrete terms for cities, for health, or for AI development. So now let's turn to the center of the discussion today, which is the State of the Digital Decade report. I will try to find my way, but okay, here I need to click. Okay, so this report is one central element of the governance of the digital decade. So every year now, since 2023, we are putting a comprehensive view on not only the stakes of the moment, but also the progress toward the objectives and the targets that we have fixed. In this process, facts is critical because we know that in order to take the right decision, we need to be enlightened by the right facts. And also, as you will see in this report and in the previous one, we are ready to take the risk of exposing the facts, even if they are tough for us. And here, the report that we issued last July was really a wake-up call in this regard. We are also taking stock of identifying the gaps that remains, but also the opportunities that we can work together with multi-country projects and edicts. One critical element also of this report is to take stock on the national roadmap, because as I said, member states are completely part of the process and they are contributing as we do here in the Commission. And they contribute essentially via the national roadmap that they have presented and adopted, in which they are capturing all the actions that they are going to take to progress toward the target and objectives of the digital decade. If we look at the overarching messages, I will go quickly. We have here first the gathering of all the different dimensions of the action that we have taken. I mean, as I think it's very clear that the EU has positioned itself as a global policy innovator over the last 5 years. But at the same time, we are still, and I will come back to that, very limited progress in many of the dimensions that we are looking at. If you look at the general objectives on competitiveness, resilience, greening, we are still way beyond our objective and our targets. For the targets, it's really the same on networks, on the production of semiconductor, take-up of advanced digital technologies, all these aspects, and I will come back to that, need really to be accelerated. And in particular, because you have new challenges that are adding to the situation. And here we'll see that the report is really addressing all these issues in 3 chapters: leadership for technology, resilience and competitiveness and sovereignty, empowering and protecting people and society, and leveraging transformation for the green transition. You may be now familiar with the scoreboard that we have now on the progress measured for each target that we have. We have about 12 targets, which are measured in a very precise way. Be aware that, for instance, for some ICT elements linked to business, for instance, we are asking questions to more than 160,000 companies in Europe. So just to show that these figures reflect really a clear picture of the situation. And you can see in this scoreboard that there are areas where we are really lagging behind on AI take-up, for instance. There are areas which are having some progress, but at the same time, we also see that including for connectivity, if you look at the fiber to premises, we realize that only 50% of the coverage of Europe territory is being operated. So that's just a quick snapshot on the situation that we have at the moment. We are not just measuring the target, we are also asking people what they think. And that's very important in a situation where we need the support of the population to continue and maintain our policy. And here the direction is quite interesting. First, you see that there are a lot of people, now 82%, that consider that we need scale matters for European companies and that we need more global players from Europe. They also see concerns in some areas. 9 out of 10, so almost 80%, consider that in the day-to-day life, they would really benefit from human support to use digital technology. So in a sense, with the rising importance of digital in our life, people see the difficulties when they cannot have access to these services because of lack of skills, because of lack of connectivity, and they are really supporting for some help there. They are also concerned in a great way, and this is really it was a surprise of the last Eurobarometer, the progress that we saw on the concern regarding the protection of children and young people. Here, clearly, there is a surge of concern, which is linked to the situation that we know, and which is linked to addictive design of some online platforms, of the confrontation also of illegal content, pornographic content, which is very important. So, just to say that this report has been also fed by this element. If I want to recap on competitiveness, I mean, basically we have 4 big issues. I mean, one is well known now, also linked to the Draghi report. And by the way, the Draghi report is referring several times to the Digital Decade report, which we were quite honored to see. But clearly there is an issue on R&D and to be at the frontier, to have frontier technology and businesses that are getting a global view. There is also a lack of connectivity. Of course, we have seen some progress on fiber networks, on 5G, but at the same time, if you look at the quality of in particular for 5G, only 50% of the territory has been covered. There is also not only a lack of network, there is a lack of take-up. Even if we have the network, for instance, in Germany, fiber take-up is only 5%, and on average. In Europe, it's almost 19%. And if you look at the take-up of technology by businesses, it's even worse. And here we have the figure of AI take-up, which is at 8%, not changing, not progressing as compared with the past. And of course, the last one is security. Security, as I said, in the start of my introduction, is an overarching concern, and there is more and more attacks. There are more and more problems that are linked to security. And today, it's clear that we cannot, have a non-secure environment and a non-secure online technology. So these 3 elements: R&D, frontier, networks, take-up, and security are the 4 key elements that we have seen in the report. I just want to show this slide just to show a bit the methodology that we are using in the report, because the conclusions that we draw are not linked to just analysis. They are linked to a very, very strict analytical approach with figures, with trajectories that we have designed together with member states, and which are leading to recommendations. And that's very important to see that we are not just making analyses, we are also drawing conclusions that are translated into advice to member states, but also for us. And here you can see that for the fiber to premises, we need to really mobilize investment. We also need to improve the single market and to foster cooperation. The second chapter of the report is about people and society. And here there are clearly needs to equip better the population with skills. Progress on skills is largely insufficient for basic skills, but also for the number of ICT specialists. You know that the target for Europe is to have 20 million of those specialists, and if we continue like we are at the moment, we are just going to end up with only 12. So we are very far from reaching our objective, and this is an area where clearly a priority needs to be put. Take up also of EID scheme and digital public services, ELs, is also not satisfactory. Also that there are progress in these areas. On EID, for instance, only 45% in Europe of the citizens are using regularly EID schemes. And that's something that is not enough if we want really to make sure that people can connect in secure terms and also being able to protect their privacy in a way that fits with their values. The rise of disinformation is, of course, a major concern and a major potential effect on our society and polarization and democracy. And of course, the regulatory framework that we have established, I mentioned the global innovator role of Europe over the last 5 years, a number of regulations that have been designed, implemented, need now to be really implemented at the full. And that's one of the areas where we have seen some still margin of progress. The last the third chapter that I'd like to mention here is about greening. I mean, smart greening, and here it's clear that there is no way that we can succeed to fight climate change without harnessing digitalization. And here we have basically two sets of issues. One is to make our digital technologies and infrastructures greener. So there is a need for massively investing into sustainable chips, sustainable edge nodes, sustainable connectivity network, in particular in the context where the footprint of the digital sector will be more and more linked to data flows rather than to devices. So with the rise of data, we need to really make sure that our technologies are green. But the second dimension, which is more positive, which is that digitalization can help really addressing the greening. I mean, if you look at the use of smart grids, the use of AI engine-empowered system that can really better help us to manage energy, the impact of those, the positive impact of those, is going to be critical if well put. So now the situation is that we have these two elements to be work on. We have progressed a lot last year on the capacity that we have to have methodologies to evaluate these two dimensions, and we need now to implement these methodologies to make sure that we can drive our sectors, industry, health, automotive, all the industry sectors to using digitalization for getting greener. And the stake for today is really to move from small pilots and use cases to a larger use of digitalization for our climate change fight. Last chapter of the report is also linked to an objective of the digital decade, which is to have more efficient, cost-effective, and to reduce administrative burden in the way we are designing and implementing our policies. And here we see that there are three main elements that needs to be fostered. I mean, first, there is ways and there are possibilities to really reduce administrative burden, looking at synergies between regulation, looking at consolidation, making sure that we can manage better the coexistence between the different regulatory framework. And here, I will come back to that, but this is one area where we see quite a lot of possibilities. The second element is really to make sure that our program that funds digitalization across the board, so in the different fields that I've mentioned, are better organized and better synergized so that we can make the best of the 205 billion for the period that are financing our digital transformation, which is a huge effort from the community with this regard. And then last but not least, in a world where we want to have dissemination of our technologies, not just in Brussels and in capitals or in hotspots, but also in rural areas, in middle-sized cities, there is a lot to be done to articulate better the action and the policies that are being organized at different levels between the European level, the national level, and the local level. So these are the main conclusion in terms of analysis of the report. And if we look at the recommendations that we are making to member states, and again, these recommendations are really built in a way that trigger a discussion with member states and trying together to progress toward achieving our objectives and targets. We have regrouped these recommendations in 4 big categories, so mobilizing investment, single market, disseminating technologies, and fostering cooperation between member states. And as you can see on this slide, we are going quite granular in the type of recommendation in order for the discussion with the member states to take place on the basis of a very concrete element. So this is maybe one of the characteristics of the digital decade, is that we try to go beyond the strategic narrative. We want to really go in the detail of the action. This is also true for the recommendation that we put for each country. So each country benefits for a specific report, which is highlighting for the different chapters. So competitiveness, people and society, and green. We are establishing the analysis for this country, looking at the progress toward their national target, with regard also with their national trajectory. And we also designed specific recommendations that are discussed with each country, which is a basis for the discussion, which is also a basis for sharing best practices, because in a sense also what we can see in the different reports is a possibility for cross-cutting element, and also for inspiring each other with the elements that we are putting in each report. If I want to wrap up with maybe 2 slides to finish my presentation. So if you have 4 points to get out of this report, I will say that there are 4 points that matters most. I mean, first, implementation and enforcement of the regulatory framework. I think this is not something that today is not heard in Brussels, but it was really clearly set in July when we drafted the report, which goes from codification, mapping reporting obligation, also designing smart regulation. So there are ways to use the technology that could help us to revisit the old regulation and maybe look at the way we could do that differently using and leveraging our technologies. And of course, here the Digital Decade Board that has been set up, that I mentioned at the very start of my introduction, can be helpful, because we are gathering here contact point of each member state who can discuss any issue on digital transformation. The second focus, I think you will not be surprised here today, is competitiveness. So here competitiveness is clearly a key element that has been put forward, by the way, already in 2024. Already when we published the first report, we had this focus on competitiveness, sovereignty, resilience. Here we need to leverage all the toolbox that we have, single market, of course, the leveraging of investment, also looking at procurement and synergies between civil and defense, given the focus that we have at the moment. And of course, all this with the objective also to support a smart green transition. Then there is a third element, which is, I've put it common goods, which is a bit gathering the elements that digital can bring for a better life, and also protecting people and making sure that their future will be better. And here, of course, security is a common good that, as I mentioned at the very start, is essential for our technologies and infrastructure. And also making sure that people and societies are better off in this new world that is coming. So there is certainly quite an effort to be made to make sure that children are protected, that disinformation can be fought, and that online spaces are healthy and safe. Last but not least, I think we are also extremely conscious of the fact that digital decade is not just the Brussels decade or the Paris or Berlin or wherever. It's really much a project for the whole society, and we are not going to succeed if we do not harness all the actors at all levels. Dissemination of technology is something which is very complex. It requires skills, it requires infrastructure, it requires an ecosystem that is local. And we need to discuss more, we need to exchange more, and we also need to get more experience. I mean, the cities, they have a huge experience in the concrete difficulties they are facing with, in terms of training, in terms of ecosystem, and the wealth of their experience needs to be really harnessed to our world. We are trying to do that already with the European Digital Innovation Labs, with edX, but there is much more to be done. And last but not least, on the Digital Decade report, my experience and our experience here in working with member states, points out the potential of best practices and sharing success stories between us. Too often we are not capitalizing on the knowledge we have on the things that work. And this is something that we try to institutionalize more in the Digital Decade Board in order for, to make sure that we can make the best of those experience and competencies. Now, before we leave to the panel, I'd like to just mention briefly that, in light of this report, and again, we were quite happy to see that the report content has been quite used in the different work. We can see that in the signals that we can see in the President von der Leyen guidelines that were issued in July, also in the different reports, but also in the letter of missions that were drafted to the commissioners. And we can see a lot of those elements reflected, including very directly when notably the President mentioned that reaching our digital target and building a true digital single market would be a game changer for our productivity and competitiveness. So here I think that there is quite a momentum to make the best use of the material that was gathered between member states and the Commission. And maybe this is something that our panel and Lynn, you can discuss now. And with this, I would like to give you the floor back, Eileen.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think everyone can see me now. Yeah, we did receive some questions already for you on Slido, but perhaps we could take them at the end. So thank you so much again for the presentation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce again our speakers. But first, let's start without further ado with you, Georg. Again, as a reminder, you're an Associate Director at the European Policy Center here in Brussels. The floor is yours, and thanks very much again.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Eric. I must say you almost said it all, Eric, and there's not much to disagree with in your presentation. I think there's a starting point here when we talk about digital and, of course, the broader economic challenges that the EU is facing that is largely shared. But of course, I think once you've said that, the critical question is not the what now, but it is the how. But you've asked me to say a few words about the Draghi report and the Digital Decade report and sort of how I see they link up. And I wanted to start with that in 3 points. The first point is, I think that Draghi, the big picture is that Draghi is obviously right in what he said. And he talks about an urgency of action. I've often spoken about make or break moments. I think that applies very much at the macro level, but it also applies very much now in specific fields, specific sectors, relating to specific technological areas and specific levers. And I was quite happy to hear you, Eric, start with the question of security. In a sense, if anything, I think Draghi is understating the risk and the urgency. I think in coming months or years, we will or might be facing a multi-front security situation we are very ill prepared for. And I think on the economic front, we are probably heading into some form of deep division or fragmentation of the international economic order. I think the world is dividing much faster, much more quickly than what we think and what we like. And to put it bluntly, I think China is using Europe as the theater of economic and security competition with the US. You can just see what's happening on EVs now and ahead of Europe's votes on tariffs for that, where in a sense, I would describe it as China being deep in our decision-making systems. And I think really to make that statement to start with, or to paint that picture, the difference now with the Cold War is that we have actors in a globalized world that are operating deep in each other's internal spaces. And I think we have to recognize that China, unfortunately, is much more in our internal space than we are in theirs. So Eric, you started talking about the security environment. I think definitely that is and should be, must be a real driver now for how we think about what one needs to do in digital, as in many other areas, energy, of course, also. And I think the difference now with the coming mandate with the previous one, if you remember, von der Leyen's first mandate started, at least in the economic field, with a program that was about the twin transition, the green and digital, and you could make strong arguments that they were synergetic. And I think now what we are facing, we've gone from 2 to 3, we're heading into a world of, in the economic field, of triple transition, green, digital, and economic security, and there are actually deep trade-offs between these 3 shifts, and the real challenge will be to navigate those trade-offs and attempting through policies and actions to make them synergetic. It's not spelled out like that in the Draghi report, but I think that's also very deeply what he's saying. He's talking about economic security being a necessary strategy for growth in Europe, and reciprocally that growth is needed for economic security. We need to also obviously to run faster, and he puts a lot of emphasis on that. That was my first point. The second point I wanted to make was on the state of the digital decade. Well, you've just run us through the presentation, and I won't go through the different markers and indicators, if you like, but there's enough in there to become deeply depressed, I must say, in the sense that the state of the digital decade in Europe is a little bit like the image of, well, of France running their 6% deficit now in what should be good times, or Germany refusing to think strategically or refusing to invest when so much is about the speed and scale of investment, massive resource mobilization. So there's plenty of things one could sort of dwell on and get hung up about, but I think also that's not the purpose of neither of think tanking nor of policy making. And what I also spot here in sort of this digital arena in Europe, the digital ecosystems, is a lot of can-do attitude. I think a lot of can be done in Europe if policies can follow. There's many things you can point to. I do think we have an army of startups in some critical areas that we really need to help grow. You can really point to also how public policies in many member states, at least in certain member states, are really helping to develop that. One example is the Dutch Growth Fund that has really spurred energies and impetus in critical areas in tech now, such as quantum, such as photonics. I think there are also EU policies, such as elements under the CHIPS Act, that are picking up on that, both on quantum and photonics, by the way. So there are things that are happening. But of course, it is really overall a question of speed and scale. But we do need to have confidence. We are still a player. We still have some form of agency, and I think that is how we still need to think about the digital decade going into the next few years. Then my third point is to say there's a lot to be discussed in the details. I read a piece, I think it was by you guys over at Bruegel, Niklas. So it was your colleague Bertin Martens who wrote a piece that was titled "Draghi Disappoints on Digital." And I agree, there is not maybe about the disappointment, but there is a lot to be discussed in terms of the how now. My message is, and what we often see when you discuss with stakeholders, or here also for the big lobbyists, from the big tech lobbyists, is people are saying, Europe needs to stop regulating and needs to start adopting. I think that is the wrong message today. I think really Europe needs to have confidence to do 4 things at the same time, and we can discuss it in more the details of it, but it is adoption, of course, yes. It is innovation, but it is also regulation and enforcement. I think there are some real big challenges that we must not forget in terms of regulation and enforcement. But a lot of the details is there to be fleshed out. I can take one example from the Draghi report, cloud. He talks rightly so about reliance on US hyperscalers being a fact. It's a reality. We can't get around it. But he's also talking of the need for a European secure cloud. I think actually he's not explicit enough. He's not going far enough in terms of what one needs to do for a European secure cloud. There was a very interesting report by the Klingendahl Institute in the Netherlands a few months back, entitled "Too Late to Act?" ? Which created a lot of waves in Netherlands in terms of how it approaches the cloud question. It goes against sort of the established thinking in many respects. That Klingendahl report was unabashedly speaking of the need for a sovereign European cloud, not pushing, of course, US hyperscalers out of the market, but really pointing to that what's here in Europe is not delivering everything we need or what we need in terms of trust, security, and also diversification. So again, not talking about replacing hyperscalers, but having the courage in European or EU policy making and national policy making to give European cloud providers space, including, for instance, through tailored procurement. And of course, we know the discussions we've had over the past years on, for instance, cloud certification. This is an example of what I'm saying. We have to have the confidence in Europe to liberate these can-do attitudes, and that requires that policies are able to follow. I will not go into further these details. One can talk about quantum, one can talk about chips, one can talk about AI. It's very clear, I think we are in some form of 11th hour fight to stay in the AI race. Semiconductors have become the hot melting pot of innovation in what is probably the most critical technological value chain today, spanning chips, cloud, data, and AI. We can't stop at the CHIPS Act. There's a second CHIPS Act that's needed. I think the real question is whether we will stay on linear policies now, faced with what are in fact exponential challenges and existential questions, or whether we have really the capacity to up our game again against the backdrop of needing to do something on adoption, innovation, but also regulation and enforcement. So I wish the new commissioner or executive vice president, Henna Virkkunen, a lot of luck, a lot of strength. A lot of comments were made in past 4 or 5 years about the relationship between Breton and Vestager. I think actually what we saw was a lot of creative tension there that produced a lot of good things. And I really hope that DG Connect and sort of the whole collective space of actors in the digital field will keep up those creative tensions and really drive forward rather than saying, okay, now it's about implementation and enforcement, because it's really about a lot more than that. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Georg, including for the the pun about the 6% deficit of the French. Much appreciated. But thanks a lot for your insights. I think we'll have a few questions for you afterwards, definitely circling back. I would like to give the floor now to Ms. Léa Offray of BEUC, the Consumer Association. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for having us. It's really nice to have the opportunity to bring the consumer voice to such an important discussion. Maybe just to come back on the connection and the alignment between this report and the Commission priorities, and also to follow up on what you mentioned, Jörg, on the Draghi report. On our side, we very much welcome the report. Some of the targets also specifically on connectivity to make sure that we will have everyone connected in a few years' time. We also really like the idea to have this synergy with the green transition, because we agree that this is something that's really key, especially at the moment where consumers now are shifting towards more sustainable modes of consumption. So this is important to really have this alignment between the different policies we have in the EU. And also part of the report about making sure we can protect people's digital rights, which is really important for us, because let me be very clear, right now, we have a problem in the digital market for consumers where consumers are not trusting the environment. So you were mentioning, for instance, addictive design, and this is something we see, and even in some of the study of the Commission, where now I was really shocked to see that we have up to 97% of the most popular apps and websites used by European consumers that are deploying at least one dark pattern. So basically, we do have a huge problem with implementing our own laws. And we have indeed some issues with the people being concerned about how their data is used and collected. At a global stage, really global level, it's up to 68% of consumers that are concerned about how their data is collected and used by companies online. So it's really hard for them to trust the online environment. And not to mention the fact that now we're also faced with a new phenomenon on e-commerce with many of products that are sent from outside of Europe, especially China, by big marketplaces that are completely violating EU law, especially when it comes to product safety, sustainability, labor rights. This is quite astonishing and something that consumer organizations are testing and alerting authorities and calling for action. So hopefully we can get there to help them trust the online environment. And so I fully agree with you that, Jörg, that now we need to look at implementation and enforcement. Really, enforcement needs to be the priority. And looking at the how that you mentioned, we need to have an enforcement strategy in Europe. This is how we can get there, really. And so we hope that this is something that we can see in the future. Now, maybe looking at the parts that we like a little less from the report and also from the Draghi report, some of the targets or some of the recommendations, we need to be very careful about what we want to have out there and to have a right balance between what is right for people and what is right for companies. So always try to find a way to reach this idea of protecting people while reaching these targets of innovation and competitiveness. This is something we're quite concerned about, especially in the telecom sector, where notably, also in some of the recommendations that you mentioned about this idea to have more giants and help telco companies grow and be competitive at the global market, we need to be very careful about this. We had the example in the past of other of our partners, especially, for instance, in the US, and this idea also in the Draghi report about consolidation, adapting the competition rules. This is not the way forward. Absolutely not. The only thing that we will have is an increase of prices for consumers, services that won't be of quality for consumers. So we need to be very careful here and not to enter that direction. There are other options that we can follow rather than this. And now, you mentioned also this disappointment on digital for Draghi. Well, this was our case, of course. When we see this mention of GDPR costs of the Act, especially when you look at the Draghi report and some of the references of the so-called cost of GDPR that go to actually a PowerPoint presentation from a US cloud company, we can have more solid evidence maybe than this. So we are still yet to be convinced on that and quite disappointed in the lack of seriousness of the evidence that was brought. But maybe another point that I wanted to mention, and then maybe Nicholas, you can rebound on that as well, that I haven't seen in the report and that was not necessarily mentioned either from Draghi, is the dimension of international trade and the new digital trade agreements that we have, and whether or not they align with the new Commission priorities and also with our digital toolbox that we have now. So we have fantastic laws now. I'm going to talk now maybe especially about the AI Act. We are seeing now in new digital trade agreements, there was one that was just signed with Singapore recently, some rules that are designed to protect EU companies that have some problems when they want to operate abroad, and they have some problems of intellectual property theft because they have to disclose the source code of their software. And we agree that it's problematic. But now in our trade agreements, what we do is that we protect these companies on top of protection they already have in several cases like international intellectual property agreement and others. And it's going to create kind of a checklist for authorities that's going to be very, very hard to implement. And we really wonder how they will be able to implement the AI Act. So you were mentioning also, Eric, this idea of long-term perspective and really coherence between policies. Here, we would like to really ring the alarm bell that what we are doing for the sake of competitiveness in the global stage, also in our trade policy, might really put at risk what we're trying to do in the digital agenda and our ability as the EU to really implement and enforce our laws, especially if we think about the lack of resources that we can already anticipate for other authorities to really implement the law. So maybe something also to keep in mind for the future, to have this global perspective and make sure that we won't have some targets that will come at the expense of people's digital rights. I will stop at here, but looking forward to hearing your points.
Thank you very much, Leah. I think just for us with the online audience joining, I think we're about over 300 people who joined. And for those catching up now, we had Gorg of the European Policy Center making the link between technological sovereignty, economic security, and competitiveness as a trade-off. Also describing that Europe still has this can-do attitude to liberate the force of innovations. And also you insisted on adoption, innovation, and enforcement. And you, Leah, you mentioned the dimensions along the lines of people trust and digital rights. And you also have put the emphasis on implementation and enforcement. And I believe it's Boek who had asked for a commissioner on implementation and enforcement a while ago. So I think your wishes came true. You also mentioned the right balance between what should be good for consumers and what should be good for businesses. And I think this is also a nice element you brought in. And the international dimension, especially mentioning digital trade. And I think this is a good time for you, Niklas, to jump in. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me and for the invitation, and congratulations to DG Connect for finishing this big report. It is a massive piece of work, and I think it's a very important area. So congratulations to that. In my intervention, I want to talk a little bit about two things. Basically, the one thing's like the priority for the next commission, but first I want to give some constructive feedback on the Digital Connect report and maybe basically a little bit of how it can evolve. Now we're coming close to the midpoint maybe of the digital decade, of what I would like to see for this work to kind of evolve and how it could become more useful. And maybe I start with that, which is, I think, is basically the digital decade report and the targets in there. They serve three distinct purposes that I see that are in some way in tension within one another. So the first one is really to provide goals for the European Commission for itself to measure its own progress. And I think this is important for everyone. We all know this from our own work life, that that basically having clear targets is important to us to measure our own progress and to say if we're doing well or not. And I think this is very clear here, also an attempt for the European Commission to say basically this is what we want to achieve, and then for citizens and for governments and for the parliament to hold them accountable to this. The second purpose is actually to just provide a benchmark for member states to see where they stand against each other and kind of do a little bit of naming and shaming, and we see this being very successful in policy areas. My personal favorite example is the PISA report in the OECD. I'm German. I grew up during the PISA shock, which was basically when the first PISA report was published, and there was a big shock in Germany because we did really terrible. And then we saw a lot of change in the way education policy was made. But just like the fact that there was a league table, and we could directly compare ourselves against people that in South Korea or in France, and could see if we do better or worse in our education. In this case, we did worse than many of most other our peers. Had a big effect, and I think the Digital Decade report and basically providing this benchmark provides an important tool in this regard. But the third, and I think this is the goal that is actually intentional, the first two is actually a political communication device. We've seen this as an example in the chip sector, where basically a target was set for the chip industry that was set basically as a way to communicate, or this is how I read it, a way to communicate ambition. So basically, the ambition that was communicated is we want to double our share in our semiconductor market by 2030. And of course, if you set goals like that for yourself or even for people that like the member states, then there's always you might not have the right incentives to set very well measurable goals, or maybe these goals might not be realistic, especially if these goals are to be delivered under the mandate of your predecessor as a commissioner. And I think the semiconductor case is one which I know very well, but I think one that is very symbolic for this. So if you think about, if you would ask, you go to business school class and they tell you how to set target, they tell you they should be SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Now, for the digital decade, all the goals are time bound, but not all of them are specific and not all of them are relevant, and some of them are actually not achievable. And I think for the CHIPS Act goal, I have not met someone in the industry that thinks 20% market share for Europe is achievable. It also, the 10% market share and the 20% market share that is presented, they are not really specific because basically they are somewhat attached. If you listen to some speeches, you see the definition changes over time. But there's actually a real definition that was employed by the people that came up with these numbers here in this house that is really real. But then basically, if this is somewhat detached from the actual policy, and it's not super clear that there's many ways you could measure market shares, this is really the relevant one. So I think here, basically, this goal has been set up in a way to kind of signify an ambition, signify a seriousness and a willingness to measure yourself. But actually, the goal that has been set is actually not really relevant, and it's actually also not achievable, and therefore you set yourself up for failure. I think this is true in some other areas. If we think, for instance, about AI take-up, it's not super clear if you question companies, do you take up AI? And they answer yes or no. It's not really clear what they answer yes or no to. Every one of us that use Google search uses an AI product. So does every company that uses Google search uses an AI product? Probably not. Does it mean ChatGPT, you use something like ChatGPT, or you even implement your own AI models? They're probably less than 11% of EU companies, or I think it's even smaller numbers that actually do this. So it's not super clear, and some of these measures actually, are they the relevant ones? Are they the good ones? And to which extent, there's a tension there on one hand between the scientific measurement that is applied to these goals, and then basically the goals that are very serious and very specific, and then actually the political communication that has defined some of these goals. And I think here, what I would like to see is basically a vision going forward for the next 5 years, go back to some of these goals and maybe be a bit more specific on what we actually want to achieve with them. And that would allow us to better benchmark us for the second half. I think this initiative in itself is very important. So I would like to see even put more seriousness into this on a high level, not just in the implementation, but also in the setting of the goal. The other thing is, I would like to say, if I would ask to basically revise the way this report is being done for the future, I would like the Commission to be tougher on member states. So especially the implementation of public services, it is a bit like the old energy labels we had on, where everything was A+, and actually the real good ones were just A+++. I feel a way here, basically, if you just have information about the availability of service on your page, you get already a lot of points. And that is the bar is too low. I think basically here it should be tougher. Now, the other. So I think this would be on the Digital Decade report itself. I think it's very important work. I think it's very important that this work is taken seriously. I just would wish that some of these goals would be basically differently defined. And that then leads to kind of the policy question is of how do you design policy based on the findings of this report? And I think one of the things, and this is very much linked to this, is that I would like to be policies to be a bit more targeted to these actual goals. Again, I would use the example of the semiconductor because it's one I know very well. But basically here, the goals of the CHIPS Act were not well enough defined, and then basically the tools were not really well targeted to these goals that are kind of vague. Or basically the vagueness of the goals then allowed, like very, in my personal sense, bad policy on the side of state aid, where basically if the goal is to double your market share, anyone that builds additional market share suddenly is entitled to very big subsidies. And especially if the ambition is as big as 20% of global market share, then yeah, basically you have to just throw, it becomes too vague. So basically, I think a definition of the problem you want to solve with your goal then can lead to better policies. And my example here would be actually what we do on the climate area. So we have very clear, defined, and very measurable goal in terms of carbon reduction. And for instance, if we think about how we build if we build wind parks, we don't just say we want to triple our capacity on wind parks and then we just hand money to anyone that wants to build a wind park indiscriminately. But actually, we define, we know exactly what we want for a specific project, and then we do tenders of whoever wants to deliver that particular amount of capacity will get a certain at the lowest subsidy level. Will get the basically win the tender. And we could, if we would know exactly what we want, for instance, from the semiconductor industry, we could do the same. We could just auction off capacity. But as long as we just define vaguely we want to increase capacity, that we cannot do that because basically it's not really clear what we want. And of course, semiconductors are not a commodity unlike electricity, but I think there's ways to design this smarter. But I think the more important one really is about the single market. And this is where I will want to go back to the Draghi report. A lot of these goals are actually really hard to achieve with digital policy in itself. So basically, that we do so poorly, as Gerrit was highlighting in some of these goals, I'm not sure that's necessarily a mistake of digital policy. It's a mistake, or it's a failure of single market policy. Basically, it is also true for the digital single market, which in that, for most intents and purposes, really doesn't exist. Anyone that moves across EU borders will notice that he loses access to all his digital media. You lose access to your banking. You cannot go to online use your banking anymore because you have a different telephone number, you have a different credit card. All of this is not interoperable. So basically the amount of geo-blocking we still have in the single market is basically a huge problem. But we also have this in other market areas. So this is something that is true. Leah mentioned digital trade in general. This is true in the world in general, digital trade. Digital trade is not necessarily held back by a lack of digital trade agreement. It's really held back by the lack of sectoral or the problem of complexity of sectorial regulation. Basically, if it is not sufficient that you can, theoretically, I could provide accounting services from someone in India to Europe. No problem. Technologically, there's no problem with that. The real problem why this doesn't happen is basically that you have to have local presence, you have to have local professional licenses, you have to have fulfill a lot of local laws that are different from every state to any other state. And we might, I think in the international area, that is a barrier, that is, we might not feel, we might want to harness more benefits from digital trade. We might want to have more Indian providers of services, for instance, in our market, that there will be clear efficiency gains from that. But we might not want to, we might not trust the regulation in the other market. Therefore, we might not be completely comfortable opening our market in that way. But in Europe, we have a real opportunity to actually define common standards that we all feel comfortable with, and then provide this service across borders. And thus far, this hasn't happened in most professions. That hasn't happened in many areas. We really have failed here. And I think this is where I'm somewhat hopeful with the energy from the letter and the Draghi report that really pushes this agenda, and they put the single market and the productivity gains of having a single market really on the agenda. So I think this is something where I think really we have to deliver. And if we think on, and this is true for basically the digital service in particular, I think basically the work here on the DMA, the DSA, the GDPR, as much pushback they get, like, I mean, I think they deliver very well on the kind of societal goals. Like I was mentioning that are not economic in nature, like your privacy of your data, but they also they serve an important efficiency purpose, because they are there. It's like the critics of these measures are somewhat right, that they say that there are costs of having a stricter privacy regulation. There are some costs. I don't think the same is true for basically having more fair markets on platforms. I think this is actually a win-win. But there are some of these digital regulations. Maybe the AI Act will impede some innovation, and that might be worth the cost of the benefits we get in terms of other societal goals might be worth that, the cost of that. But we can lower these costs if we do this at the EU level. If we have a regulation where basically the same rules apply to anyone in the single market, instead of we doing it at the national level. And I think this is where actually this agenda has been very successful. But we have not really made the same. Haven't really made the same progress when it comes, for instance, to other markets. When it comes to markets of digital media, which are very much fragmented. We haven't made this progress in stuff like financial services. So what is the saving now called the Saving and Investment Union, but used to be called the Capital Markets Union. Really, the problem that for startup, it's really hard to scale up because of the complexity of having to manage many different European markets, not just the digital regulation, but also the regulation of the specific service you want to provide in the market. The complexity, but also the complexity of just getting financial means that are much easier to get in the United States, where you have a deep and connected venture capital markets, and we will not catch up on emerging digital innovative markets like AI with our startups. We will not achieve these goals that are set out in the digital decade if we do not finish our capital markets union. And I think this is just the reality, and the same is true for many other services. Basically, we leave so many productivity gains on the table because we have a fragmented market in so many areas. It's services which are the one that's easiest to do. I think the last one I want to say is basically just a plea for competition. One of the reasons, so if you look at the Draghi report, and basically he frames the issue of Europe going forward, or the competitiveness issue, as a productivity issue. And one of the big findings, and I think the literature agrees with him, is one of the reasons why Europe is less productive than the United States and has fallen back, at least Western Europe, advanced Europe, and the richest countries in Europe have fallen back on that, is basically because companies do not take up digital tools. It's not even that we don't generate these digital tools in Europe, but actually companies do not take them up. And why is that? And some of that is digital literacy, but I think a big part of that is just the protection of these markets. Like you're not forced to innovate because the government shields you from competition. And we have seen too little kind of competitive forces in the market in recent years. And I think this is something where we really have to strive to improve that. But also we've seen a pushback against competition. We see this now with the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, where basically companies really try to kind of, we have a lot of malicious compliance to these measures, and companies make a lot of arguments why this would be very bad for innovation. So I think there really one has to maintain course. But also we see this in markets like telecoms, where basically there's a big push by national operators to consolidate national markets in a way that would be harmful for competition, and then also therefore be harmful for consumers. So I think here really my plea would be to stay course on competition, and stay course on single market, and actually double down on completing the single market as a measure to complete the competition. I haven't really followed up on digital trade. So I think for me, digital trade, the biggest issue really is the complexity of sectoral regulation. So it's basically having a digital trade agreement that helps you to set the level playing field for doing digital services, trading digital services. But then if you cannot trade the services in the first place, there's nothing you can achieve through that. And I think this is where the complexities, this is where the problems are. And we have made too little progress in that, internationally, but also in the EU.
Thank you very much as well, and also for being so candid when it comes to our own Digital Decade report. We took good note, and perhaps Eric, at the end, you will want to close on and respond to some of your comments. Thank you. I was wondering, before we move to some of the many questions and comments that were posted on Slido, whether you wanted to briefly react to each other's inputs. So please, Georg, if you want.
Yes, thank you. So this is a discussion, right? So I agree with most of what Leyen and Niklas are saying, but there are also some points of disagreement I'd like to highlight also for the sake of discussion. First of all, on enforcement, of course, the main gist of what you're saying, I fully agree with. Problem with GDPR, contrary to what Mario Draghi is saying, is not that we have the GDPR. Is that it's not been properly enforced because of the governance structure that was put in place, because Irish authorities, to say it bluntly, not doing their job. And in a sense, what we're getting as companies and consumers is the worst of GDPR, but not the benefits that were there potentially in that legislation. So it's not a matter of lifting the pedal, the foot off the gas pedal in terms of enforcement. One really needs to speed up. And similarly, on enforcement, I would even push it further than Leia. I think if you look at the DSA today, I think we are facing fundamental existential challenges for our society and our democracies if we're not ready to carry on and carry through with what we are have given us the means to do now. I think tech is largely weaponized these days. Big tech is weaponized. We have the case for well over a decade that the big platforms, they have been accountable to no one. They have not been subject to proper regulation and enforcement in terms of the role they play in our society. The history of telecommunication or broadcasting has always been one, both in the US and in Europe, of a public interest test. And for some reason, because we started thinking that internet equals democracy, equals freedom, we got a lot of push from this in the 2000s, successive US administrations. We said, well, actually, yes, it is freedom, it is free speech, nothing to worry about. And we're moving now from a state of tech as being accountable to no one to something even worse. And that's why I say tech is being weaponized. Say it directly, Elon Musk, so the leading tech figure in the world, he is not only conducting his business and his engagement today being accountable to no one or trying to be, he's actually proactively a super spreader of forms of disinformation, of innuendo, of half-truths, or directly false claims that are directly impacting how our societies function and can be governed. Look at the role of X and also what he said in the context of the riots you had in the UK. So, and I think this is a real important enforcement question that is lying around there. I think disinformation is rampant, and we are heading with AI and into the space of possible deep fakes. They're already around, into a public space in Europe and a trust in society that can actually break down. In a couple of years, we might be in a situation of describing our own public space in the way one used to describe the Russian public space, a space where everything is possible and nothing is true. And our societies will not function, our governments, our democracies will not function without trust. And I think this is a DSA story right now. We have the DSA, not everything is perfect, but this needs to put into action. And the DSA has, in the right way the Commission goes about it, started the enforcement. You had last December the designation of the very large online platforms. Then you've had the request for information. You've had the opening of proceedings. You've had additional requests for information. You have had preliminary findings before the summer. And of course, X and other platforms, because it's not only X, it's many other platforms, have the right to defend themselves against charges. But very quickly now will come and should come on the table of the college, the requirement to go into decision and enforcement of this. And then you're talking about using the toolbox that you have in the DSA in terms of fines and in terms also potentially of preliminary injunctions or stopping activities and these kind of things. And I think no matter what kind of administration we have on the other side of the Atlantic in the US, this is really a critical file, a critical action for the von der Leyen mandate coming up. We must absolutely not back down in terms of enforcement of the rules that we put in place, because this is existential for how our societies will look in the future. And I think probably, Leah, you won't disagree with that. Where I wanted to say I disagree slightly with both of you actually is on competition policy, because you frame this in terms of right for people versus right for companies. And whether we have competitive markets in Europe. I wouldn't say that we have a problem of too little competition in many areas of the digital industries in Europe. Quite the contrary, we've had a situation of monopolistic or semi-monopolistic situations across much of fundamental digital services centered around the platforms and big tech. And I think we have been way too timid in terms of competition enforcement towards them. And I don't think we can say either that on telecoms the problem is a lack of competition. If you look and compare telecom prices that we're facing as consumers in Europe, they're way lower than what you have in the US. So it's not a lack of competition. We have been enforcing very well competition, but I think what goes to the heart of the problem now, if you want appropriate regulatory framework and enforcement spanning texts like DMA, DSA, and also competition enforcement, is that we need to move away actually from the consumer welfare standard. We have been thinking that what's good for people is good for the whole of society, and superficially so. We've been saying, okay, Google search is essentially for free. It benefits me as a consumer, it benefits you as a consumer. Let's not be too tough on it. But I think now this consumer welfare standard that we've been applying for 2 decades, since we imported it from the US, is coming up short, and you're seeing competition policies that are much more progressive, much more aggressive, if you want, in the US, in trying to solve the multiplicity of issues that arise in terms of monopolistic and semi-monopolistic situation. So I really think that, yes, we need to change our competition doctrine into something much more ambitious. That's what I want to say on enforcement. And then maybe then on the other leg we have to walk on, which is innovation and industrial policy in digital. I very much agree with you, Niklas, what you say. We have these tendencies of setting targets. You mentioned 20% in the CHIPS Act. There's plenty of them in the Net Zero Industry Act also, that in the end mean nothing and bind no one. And in a sense, that is to me the debate of the last mandate. What really needs to happen now is to try to translate what one needs to do into the how, as we both said. And I think that means quite a number of new initiatives. You spoke about CHIPS Act. I think we need a CHIPS Act too, a 2.0. I don't know whether one will find the resources for it, but I think it's needed. If you look at the previous CHIPS Act, there are plenty of good things in it, but in a sense, it completely missed 2 fundamental debates. One was on the coming importance of AI and the importance of chips for training and also for inference in that. There's virtually nothing on that. And also, it missed the debate on the power efficiency that we will be needing for in order to make sure that what's happening in the digital field remains compatible with our green ambitions. I think we're seeing insatiable performance needs from AI, and in reality, AI will be needing vastly more efficient computing by factors of hundreds, or maybe even more, if we are to stay compatible with what we do in terms of our digital society with our climate targets. This is not something the CHIPS Act addresses. And if just pointing to do those 2 things there, I think a form of CHIPS Act 2.0 is urgently needed if we want to be relevant in this. There are clear areas one should go after. There are interesting companies in Europe that are leading in sort of being potential rivals to NVIDIA, but they need to be able to scale up. So we need to have this capacity to focus on inference and power efficiencies and key factors in semicon. And I think that requires, in reality, rethinking what is industrial policy at European level. If you look at what happened in parallel to the CHIPS Act, you had the EU betting tens of billions of euro through the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And that was picked up largely by Spain and Romania. But trying to take this money and put it on areas in Europe that are largely devoid of technological leadership and ecosystem. That cannot be EU industrial policy. Why are we putting tens of billions through the RRF into chips that is being placed on ecosystems that don't exist? That's not how we will succeed. So I think this is the real element. I don't think that Draghi is picking up enough. The chip nodes are getting ever thinner. But if we are spreading EU tech and industrial policy thin across the whole continent, it will never work. So we need to have this capacity to focus on where the capacities are and to make also risk-seeking bets, equity, all the whole stories that's being discussed around Europe's public-private investment capacity, and it requires a proper industrial policy at EU level. And I would actually focus more on that than on the fact that we need to stick to our guns in terms of today's competition policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just being mindful of time, that we have 15 minutes left, and there are many comments in the chat. So I will just try to briefly let you react, of course. There's a lot to unpack, of course. So, but you mentioned something about competition policies. Also, in your first intervention, the creative tension between Breton and Vestager. Commissioner Breton and Executive Vice President Vestager. And there was one question posted in the chat just for you to know about how to prevent the take-up and the takeover of our most advanced companies. So maybe that's something you can reflect on if you wish. And there was one question for you, Leah, as well, on your proposals to deliver on the connectivity objectives, because you hinted at that in your intervention. So maybe I'll just let you both speak freely and openly, but if you wish to take up any of those. And one last point, I have a colleague texted me, I think it was about one of the comments you made on the take-up of AI technologies not being sufficiently defined, and she just commented quickly that it is clearly defined and it's about 7 technologies. But then again, just to encourage everybody, also we have a methodology that comes with the report, so I'm sure you have taken a look at it, but I just wanted to share her comment. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for having the opportunity to react. I think on competition, we would need another hour. So, but no, I think what's important for us is just to reach the right balance. I hear you when you say, I mean, on the consumer welfare angle. Now, what we're hearing is also with all this idea of consolidation and creating giant to be competitive, let's be very careful about what we're doing here and make sure we strike the right balance between how we can get to competitiveness and innovation without putting at risk the acquis that we have, because we need, at the end of the day, fair markets for consumers, competitive markets for consumers. And I agree that in some sectors, we need more competition. The consumer movement is really for that. So no worries on this. And I agree also with you on the need to be even stronger on enforcement. And you were mentioning enforcement of the DSA. I think for us, it will be key to see where we are going and how the EU is positioning itself in the short term, especially with Chinese companies like Temu and Shein, where I mean, the consumer movement has brought evidence of actual violation of the DSA and raised that to authorities. Let's see, will we will continue to be naive and a bit slow power, or will the EU become really assertive and implements the DSA properly with teeth, so that we can send a strong message to the world and we can have markets where consumers can feel really safe and treated fairly. And regarding the question on connectivity, I don't have a lot to develop on this. It's just to say that we really welcome this idea to make sure that everybody will be connected by 2030. It's the basic thing that we need. So we really encourage also DG Connect to continue the good work in that trajectory.
Yes, so maybe I want to one comment, one response on the CHIPS Act. I mean, I think actually there's not that much disagreement on on competition. I mean, I would say that basically I very much agree that we had political competition in some digital markets, and I don't think, I mean, the sentiment that is now shared was part of the Draghi report, but he was on Monday with us at Bruegel and kind of, I mean, I think he kind of stated that actually was misunderstood, but the initial understanding of some of his comments or the way it was written in the Draghi report was basically that he thought there was too much competition in telecoms, and I don't think that is the case. Because anyone that has lived in the United States knows that prices there are multiple and actually quality of service is actually worse than in Europe. So it's really not a point that resonates at all with me or my colleagues that are know much more about telecommunication. So on the CHIPS Act, I mean, maybe this is not a talk about industrial policy, but I think it is an interesting example of why one needs to find the goal. Because actually, I think you mentioned the example of NVIDIA. NVIDIA is not a company that would have benefited from the CHIPS Act, because all the money in the CHIPS Act went towards manufacturing of chips. And NVIDIA doesn't manufacture a single chip. All of it is manufactured for TSMC, which is not an American company. So I think really here there is like basically the question of we are chasing often too much the last thing. And the last thing in 2001 and 2 was chips factories. And now the thing is design. I was always the opinion we should go for design, but actually I think maybe we have now the risk that with politicians see that design is the thing that NVIDIA is the company anyone envies. Maybe now we put 40 billion on design, and then we also maybe not have that much to show for it in the future. I don't know. But I think it's also very telling. I think the CHIPS Act is very telling about the things that go wrong. Because basically, both in industrial policy, but also in the single market. Because basically, there was only one company. German government put 10 billion euros on the table for anyone to take up. And there was only one company that was willing to take this money. And this was a company that's basically failed. And basically, this company was better at kind of managing relationship with certain commissioners and ministers of economics than they were actually at running their own company. And I think this is really where this stuff works out. We should question ourselves, A, is it good policy to just hand out money like this? And basically, and B, even if we put that much money on the table, why is no one willing to build such a factory in Europe? And I think this is where we have to work on. The other parts are much more important. Taiwan and South Korea, they don't necessarily have the same budget as we have to just throw money at these companies, but they do many other things to make these companies very comfortable. So I don't think we want to replicate Taiwanese labor laws. I don't think there's any appetite for that. But I think there's something that basically just putting money on the table, industrial policy, will not solve our problems. So I think we really have to think more about the market conditions, and actually we should think more about what is our strengths. And actually, I would personally think we have more strength in research and development than we have in the manufacturing, which is why I always thought this focus on foundries is a bit misleading. But anyway, so on the point on AI, I'm happy to hear there. It's not something I know very well, so I'm happy to be corrected there. I would still stick to the general point that I think that sometimes that the goals needs to be specific, and I think also the goals need to involve. So I don't know what these 7 conditions are. Basically, AI has changed fundamentally the last 2 years. So maybe our goals. So my plea would then be basically, or maybe not in this particular area, but I think we really have to be specific in our goals, and we have to also evolve our goals. And what does it mean? What is a good target for Europe to take up on AI? Which should be very different today than it was 5 years ago. And maybe I leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Just to inform you that we've posted some polls online, and we asked what would be the most effective means to reach the goal. And the majority of you think it's about more in-house industry-led upskilling and reskilling programs. So I would like to give you one last chance to briefly react to each other's inputs and opinions before giving back the floor to Eric for concluding remarks. But perhaps just to chip in, what I noticed is that there was a link that was made increasingly between democracy, people's rights in your interventions, but also economic security and sovereignty. And you mentioned in terms of economic security, you also mentioned the weaponization of technologies. And I think the good news here is that we have an executive vice president level that is attributed to those dimensions. So it's really about sending a signal. I think that we are speaking, we are hopefully walking the talk, not just drafting pages like our wonderful report here. And thank you so much again for your comments. I would like to ask you perhaps to wrap up if you had 1 or 2 targets or objectives from the digital decade that you think the EU should focus on in the next 5 years as some sort of short-term priorities to really invest our efforts into. What would that be? Perhaps as closing thoughts. Thank you so much again.
I can start. Maybe I like this question about what should the EU focus on, and I think I'll give 3 answers if I may. Maybe I will go there. But the first one is something that is not part of the main goals right now, but I think should be. And then it's part of the report, but it's not one of the highlights of this, which is basically digital security. So basically, what should be the goals for Europe going forward? We can think about quantitative goals there, basically the damage of cyber attacks or something of the sorts, basically actually really putting the focus and the highlighting. I think the purpose of these reports and also of this scoreboarding is also to highlight issues, no? And I think this is an issue that I think should be highlighted going forward. The other one is something really where I think this Digital Decade Report does a really good job, which is basically putting a benchmark for public administrations. And I think this is something where actually the EU can deliver. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for the EU to show something like the digital wallet and these kind of initiatives, and actually helping member states to develop their digital services. The question here is a bit the visibility. I think member states are very keen to claim ownership of some of these initiatives, and actually it's going to be a challenge here for the EU to actually show that it is also an important player here to citizens, but I think it's an important one. But the last one I think that is for me would be actually building startups, helping startups to scale up, building innovation and doubling down. And I'm a bit worried because I see actually more almost backtracking on this. So we had recently elections in the Netherlands, and it seems to be there's a debate now about erecting new language barriers in the education system and actually scaling down, maybe reducing education, research spending and education spending in universities. And this is the opposite of what we need. So I think really here, supporting innovation in universities and research, but also creating the right conditions for SMEs and startups to scale up should be a priority.
Yes, and on my side, I will also just focus on 3 points. As I mentioned, I think one thing that would be really essential if we really want to have the EU being seen as no longer naive, but really assertive, is to have this digital enforcement strategy and to also go forward with something about the Digital Fairness Act also that President von der Leyen mentioned. And then maybe something more concrete on your to-do list that is still not happening. You know, we still have, in the telecom sector, we're mentioning the lack of competition and the need to push them a bit to be a bit more innovative. We can think also of abolishing the intra-EU calls fees that we still have, because abolition of roaming fees was really a success story of the EU, something people can relate when it's time for elections. Next step, abolition of intra-EU calls fees. It's a really easy one, and then you will spur a bit the competition and will be more competitive as well.
I guess it falls on me then to say, come with the final ideas. It won't be strikingly original compared to what Leah and Nicola say, because I agree very much with the point they made. Maybe I can just state it slightly differently. I think in terms of regulation, we should not lose our courage in terms of going after big tech. And I put it a bit bluntly like that. It's not because I have something against big tech per se. It's not because of, I think Europe should have protectionist instincts. On the contrary, we use their services every day, companies and individuals, and I have no problem with that. But there are some real cross-society and cross-economy stakes there that are not being properly addressed. And I think we have moved in a position now vis-a-vis the US, where actually in many respects, the US has a more proactive agenda on this under the current administration than we have. And of course, the tools are different, but I think really the next commission needs to join up the regulatory tools that have been put in place with also competition treaty powers. There are treaty powers in the competition in terms of structural measures that have never been used. And I think we would have been well advised to have more courage to look into that earlier. So that's one point. Then for the rest, I must say I 100% agree with what Nicola was saying on digital security. I started this morning talking about the security dimension. It's really an area where we need to change our software as Europeans. This is not our DNA. This is not the DNA of our institutions to think security. But there are some real fundamental stakes there, and it's sort of across sectors. I think there's sort of a tacit consensus today that we can't, for instance, in the context of our offshore wind ambitions that are huge, have Chinese windmills because of IT and OT security. Nobody's really spelling it out, but I think it's out there. You're not seeing it. But those issues are there. But of course, there are big trade-offs involved in terms of our capacity then to reach our climate targets and energy transition. So we have to be courageous and take those debates. But we see again on EVs from China, we're having a level playing field debate. There is also a security debate. They are full of sensors. Teslas cannot go into public buildings in China. That's for a reason. We are waking up to these debates, I think, too slowly. Again, it's not because of protectionist instincts. It is because we are going into a world which is about security, and it is about securitizing the economy. And then, of course, the third point was also said by both colleagues, upscaling, scaling up our startups. Our startups exist. We need the capacity to make them scale. This is a lot about mindset, about believing that we can do it in areas like quantum, where everything is not lost. On the contrary, we have good starting positions. But it is also about the right policies. And the point you make about, I mentioned the Dutch Growth Fund, it's been fantastic, but there is discussions about not deploying it or scaling it back. And that's the wrong mindset. That means you're no longer investing in the future. And then there was a question from the audience about what can we do in a sense to protect European companies. Well, the best answer is to help them run faster. Having the right single market, the right investment framework. And yes, we do need some investment screening in Europe too, but I think the investment screening in Europe should be less of very administrative and slow foreign direct investment screening that goes through administration, that makes startups lose time. If you're a startup of 5 or 6 or 15 people, you can't devote resources to that. It's more about building that mentality and that culture into the ecosystems and those that accompany them. I've been working a bit on the quantum field. If you look to the Dutch quantum program, they have an investment screening program, which is about saying to the startups they're investing in, okay, let's think through together. We're putting money into your startup. Let's think through together what kind of other investors you have. It's not going to the Dutch ministry and saying, you do a screening and tell us yes or no. It's actually doing this as part of ecosystem development. And that kind of mentality, scaling up together with also security mentality is something we need to get to. But we need to believe and have confidence that we can succeed in a digital age and digital decade. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I think it's very difficult to conclude after such a stimulating and rich panel. Many things were said, and be confident that we have noted everything that was mentioned today. We have noted also the questions, and Elaine will come back to that. Maybe if I had to say a couple of elements, pointers. First, I think that there is quite a large consensus on the diagnosis, on the thing will not happen, the success will not happen automatically. In a sense, if Europe wants to have a successful digitalization, we will have to work on it. And by the way, those who are possibly a bit more successful, like in the US or in China, I mean, it's a result of a strategy developed over time. I remember that one of the experts that of the reasons explaining the success of the Silicon Valley in the US. I mean, it wasn't led by a decade of energy and means and capacity and focus. It was several decades. It was really the fact that since the World War II, the frontier, the technological frontier, was really seen as a priority from the US, and they have invested money, subsidies. I mean, Santa Clara is one of the counties in the US which receives the most defense subsidies, for instance. So just to say that whatever the solution, whatever the direction, it will take a lot of efforts, and there will be no silver bullet to that. And I think that today we have heard a lot of the elements that we need to foster on, building on the report. So the focus on innovation is clear, skills, SMEs, digitalization of businesses, the focus on AI, and again, there is a lot in the report that we could not mention today, which are there. I mean, the CMU, the Capital Market Union, is of course one of the central pieces that we think is very important for letting our unicorns to rise and to develop and to stay in Europe. The question of international is also addressed in the report. On the question of the level of ambition of targets, of course, it's always difficult, and we really, if you look at the details, at the facts, at the KPIs that we are using, there is a lot of work. I mean, linked with Eurostat, linked with studies, the e-government benchmark is extremely detailed, and all these elements. I think it's quite a standard for this type of studies, for having such an effort to really have factual and high quality data to underpin our judgment. Of course, the level of ambition in the end is a choice. And, we had this Paris Olympic a few weeks ago. I mean, you will not meet someone who will be getting the gold medal that will say, no, I didn't want to have a medal, but I still tried. So in a sense, what we are trying here is to get the gold medal. And the gold medal is not easy to get. And sometimes you may say, and you may think that it's impossible. At the same time, we also see, in the past, we also have seen that there were things that we thought would be impossible, and we did it. I mean, Airbus, building the best and the top airplane, in the world was not really something that was done from scratch. I mean, Euro is another way. There are plenty of things that, if we do want to do things, we can. I think we have also had a lot of fresh views and stimulating view for the next step. I mean, one of the elements of the decade is that we are going to have a review by 2026. It will be a possibility to improve the coverage of our objectives, of our targets. In the DDPP bulletin itself, there is a reference of cybersecurity, for instance, as an area where we could improve the digital decade. On green, on data, there are certainly ways to make it happen. But we should be aware that the decade, as it is at the moment, is very is very lonely on the global stage as an attempt. So in a sense, we don't have some similar strategy, and we are learning by doing in this respect. The last two things that I'd like to mention is that I can see also some political momentum to move forward. And we can see in the guidelines, in the letters of admission, even in the title. I mean, the first time that, as Aline was saying, we have an executive vice president for sovereignty, tech sovereignty, for security and democracy altogether. So it shows that the level of ambition is quite high. And I'd like to finish with a word that I will take from Georg, which is confidence. A lot is also about the capacity that we have to bring confidence, not only here, but with all the actors that we need to work on. And I think that one of the points that you made on the fact that targets need also to get some ownership by the actors is very important. We need to bring the society around this, because it's not only a matter of Brussels or national governments or authorities. It's something that need to embark a lot of people. And to embark, I'd like to, if you allow me, to make a surge of the Iron Age into the digital age, and to quote Seneca. You certainly know this quote, which says that it's not because things are difficult that we don't dare it. It's because we don't dare it that things are difficult. So maybe getting the confidence that we can make it, let's dare, and let's try to make it better. In any case, to shape a really successful digital transformation for Europe. With this, I think I've finished, Aline.
Thank you, Eric. I can't beat you with all the great quotes you just mentioned. So thank you for the nice concluding remarks. And again, thank you to all our wonderful speakers here for joining us today, and to our online audience that is always so supportive and following us throughout. Let me mention that, of course, we didn't have time to address all the questions and comments, but as mentioned at the start, we will post some reflections to address them online on Futurium. Please stay tuned. We will, of course, have next year already in our mind with the next report, but also some events will follow. We'll have a strategic workshop in December, so stay tuned. And thank you so much for your attention and your time. Bye.